In our last module, we covered a type of competition called perfect competition. Perfect competition is usually our starting point in economics when we start talking about competition because it's considered the ideal. You can't get more competitive than a perfectly competitive industry. And we came up with some characteristics that describe an industry that would make it a perfectly competitive industry. So let's recap what those characteristics are again. First, in terms of how many firms there were in perfect competition, there were many firms. All these firms were all selling an identical product, or sometimes we called that homogeneity. So in other words, there's no product variety at all. If you think about a perfectly competitive market for cheese, there's just cheese. You walk into the grocery store and all they have is an identical kind of cheese, no brand names, no variety, nothing. Now we didn't talk much about this last time, but this is really why these two characteristics are why perfectly competitive firms are price takers. They have no control over the price of their good because there are many other firms selling the identical good. So if somebody walks in and tries to sell the same product for more, they're not going to sell anything. Because why pay more for a good that you can get right next door at another firm for a cheaper price? So these firms have no control over price, and the reason they have no control over price are these two characteristics. Now, the next characteristic that we said there that was true about these firms are barriers to entry. And in a perfectly competitive industry, there are no barriers to entry. And this, we haven't talked about this yet as well, this will be covered in our next video. This is why these kinds of firms, perfectly competitive firms and perfectly competitive industries, make no economic profits. And we use the Greek letter pi there to stand for profits frequently. They make no economic profits in the long run. Now, another assumption about perfect competition that we don't really go too much into in this course, but you might in a later course, is something called information symmetry. And all this is saying is that all of the firms have perfect information. There isn't one firm that has more information about anything than any other firm. So everybody's kind of operating from the same basis. Now, the thing about perfect competition is that it's extremely rare. There aren't many industries that you can think of that actually fit all of these characteristics, right? Can you think of an industry where you have a lot of firms selling completely identical products? You can think of a lot of industries where there's a lot of sellers, but this product homogeneity is really what makes a standout in perfect competition. Maybe the only exception you can think about are some forms of agriculture. Like, for example, the market for wheat or the market for soy or corn. Sellers in those markets are usually selling a good that is almost, if not completely identical. There's lots of farms, so that's pretty much the only example of perfect competition you can think of. Now, let's move on to monopoly. Let's go through these characteristics and talk about how a monopoly is different. And traditionally in economics, we start out with perfect competition, and then we go to the opposite extreme, perfect uncompetition, if you want to think of it that way. This is as uncompetitive as you can get. So let's talk about the number of firms. This is really what makes a monopoly. A monopoly, there is one firm, and that is one seller of a good. Now there's actually a related kind of market called a monopsony, and that is when there is one buyer of a good. We won't really go into depth in that in this course, but it might come up in a later course. So we have one firm, And since there's only one firm, only one product, so we don't have to worry about whether these are heterogeneous or homogeneous. They're just all the same good. Now, the key thing then is, if you have one firm, why is there one firm? Well, there's only one firm because there is some form of barrier to entry. So that is why there's only one firm in that market. So the barriers to entry can take three forms. Right? Why would there be barriers to entry? What keeps other firms from entering this industry? So some of those barriers might be what are called natural barriers, such as ownership of a key resource. An example of that actually is no longer true is the diamond market. Used to be a it used to be a monopoly because there was one family that owned every diamond mine in the world, but that's actually no longer the case. Another source of barriers to entry are high fixed costs. And this is why in a lot of areas you would have a monopoly being the sole provider of utilities like electricity, because it takes a lot of money to start up a power plant, and it's hard to justify entering a market like that if you know you're going to have to spend a lot of money to get into it, and there's already one dominant player who's already possibly even earning profits. Now, the final and more common source of barriers to entry are regulatory barriers. And there are many, many examples of regulatory barriers. And one of my favorite is patents. When the government issues a patent, they are basically giving a firm or an individual the sole right to produce that good or license somebody else to produce that good. So that's a way that monopolies are actually created. We tend to think about government stepping in and preventing monopolies, but in many cases, the most common source of a monopoly is actually that the government created that. Now, in terms of information symmetry, we don't really have to worry about that too much because there's no other firm to worry about having asymmetric information with. So we can ignore that aspect of competition for right now. Now, these, in reality, are also pretty rare. It's hard to think about true monopolies that are permanent, even patents expire. So they're not very many examples of monopolies out there.